Hello and welcome to today's Distinguished Speaker Series event at Bakersfield College. Please stay online. We will start momentarily.
And we are live.
Thank you. All right. We will be starting momentarily, right at 10 o'clock. And welcome. Welcome to today's Distinguished Speaker Series at Bakersfield College, hosted by the Bakersfield College Student Government Association, BCSGA, and the Office of Student Life in collaboration with the History Department and Women and History and More Committee. These webinars and many other student-centered events are made only possible by the Bakersfield College BCSGA KVC Student Services Sticker Program, which students have the option to purchase at the time of registration. For more information, please visit bakersfieldcollege.edu/BCSGA. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. This webinar is streamed to various social media posts and will be recorded and made public available up to 2 weeks after the event for students. Closed captioning is available by clicking on the closed caption button at the lower part of the screen. This is the webinar event, thus you will not be able to show your video or walk through or talk through your mic. The chat feature for this webinar has been available to engage with the panelists and other attendees. All inappropriate questions and/or comments will be removed immediately. To pose a question, in the lower part of your screen, you will see a Q&A button. This is to submit your questions to us. We will review the questions and ask them at the end of the speaker's presentation. We may either respond to the questions live or respond to it via the module. The Distinguished Speaker Series brings community leaders from around the world to Bakersfield whose achievements have had international or national significance. Each speaker was proposed to BCSGA by either a department or a faculty member. Collaboration between many entities on campus make these events successful each year. The events are free and open to the public. All events this year will be scheduled via a Zoom on a virtual platform. For more information on future speakers, please visit bakersfieldcollege.edu/student events. Please note today's webinar will be recorded. In the case of technical issues, please stay online as we work through them. In the case of disconnection, please join us on Facebook Live at facebook.com/SGABC. If you have any questions to ask during the presentation, please submit them through the Q&A module so the moderator will be able to respond. As a reminder, we have another presentation at 2 p.m. Please visit bakersfieldcollege.edu/student events/DSS to register for the next Zoom presentation. Without further delay, I welcome Professor of History, Erin Miller, to introduce today's distinguished speaker.
Thank you, Nikki, and thank you to the entire team, including Benny and Danielle at the Office of Student Life. Before I introduce Elaine Weiss, I would like to talk a little bit about women's history and more. As Nikki said, my name is Erin Miller, and I am a professor of history at Bakersfield College. I am a member of the steering committee that helped select Elaine Weiss come speak today. We celebrate women's contributions contemporarily and historically, and we have a few other events this month we would like you to keep in mind, which is on March 10th, we have an event related to COVID and online education at 6:30 p.m. And on March 25th, we have an event related to COVID and women's health in particular. So look for information on those. But today's event is really an event that we attempted to organize for last year, the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which was the women's right to vote being constitutionally protected for national elections. So it's our great honor today to have Elaine Weiss here. She is a very awarded and recognized journalist and writer, and her book is The Woman's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote. It's available in the Bakersfield College bookstore, and I encourage you to read it. She's an award-winning journalist and writer, as I said. Her magazine feature writing has been recognized with prizes from the Society of Professional Journalists, and her byline has appeared in the Atlantic, Harper's, New York Times, Boston Globe, Philadelphia Inquirer, as well as reports and documentaries for the National Public Radio and the America. She's been a frequent correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor. Her long-form writing garnered a Pushcart Prize, Editor's Choice Award, and she is a proud McDowell Colony Fellow. Her first book, Fruits of Victory, The Woman's Land Army in the Great War, was excerpted in the Smithsonian Magazine online and featured on C-SPAN and public radio stations nationwide. Weiss holds a graduate degree from the Medill School of Journalism of Northwestern University. She has worked as a Washington correspondent, congressional aide, and Speechwriter Magazine editor and university journalism instructor. Speechwriter Magazine editor and university journalism instructor. I'm sorry, that repeated itself twice there, so I repeated myself twice. Her book, The Woman's Hour, is a wonderful, rich, biographical, micro and macro history of the fight for the ratification of the 19th Amendment in Tennessee. She situates her history in the biographies of individuals like Carrie Catt and Josephine Pearson and Snow and others. So I invite you to pay close attention, to read her book and formulate her questions. We have many for her already, and we look forward to her presentation. So Elaine?
Thank you so much, Professor Miller, and I'm delighted to be with all of you today, at least virtually, to celebrate Women's History Month and to talk about the power and the potential of stimulating change. I want to tell you a story, and this story is more than a century old, and yet it's very timely. It's a story about democracy and Americans' ambivalence toward true democracy and the struggle to improve that democracy. That's certainly been a topic in the news lately. Democracy is fragile. It must be sustained and nurtured. It's a story about voting rights, which is certainly an essential issue right now. And it's a story about social justice and the role of protest and the power of citizen activists. And your state of California plays a dramatic role in this story. And we're looking at an iconic poster that was the symbol of one of the California suffrage referendums in 1911. And it's a beautiful one, and we'll be talking about that more. It's the story of American women's demand for the most fundamental right in a democracy, the vote. A demand which was once considered radical, crazy, subversive, impossible. But it was slowly and arduously transformed into constitutional law. It became law as the 19th Amendment, the largest extension of voting rights in our history, giving the vote to half of the citizens of the nation who were not included when the founding fathers constructed our government supposedly by and for the people. And we just commemorated the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, women's right to vote, this past summer. In the broadest sense, this is a story about how change, even imperfect change, can be made in a democracy and in society. What it takes to make change, beginning with individuals and expanding into mass movements. That's an important conversation we need to engage in right now, as we hear loud calls for fundamental change. And we've witnessed tens of thousands of our fellow citizens demonstrating in the streets for change. The 19th Amendment was not just a legal change, not just a constitutional change, not just an election law change. It didn't just double the national electorate. It didn't just make women full citizens for the first time. It actually marked a societal change, a cultural shift in the role and the rights of women in society. And that's what made it so controversial and so complicated and so difficult. And of course, we're still undergoing that change today. But it's just that type of societal shift in hearts and in minds, in attitudes and actions, manifesting itself eventually into law that will be required for us to tackle inequality in our own time. The fight for women's suffrage is one of the defining civil rights struggles in our nation's history. And it's one that cuts to the heart of what democracy means. Who gets to participate in our government? Who has a voice? When we say we, the people, do we really mean everyone? And we are still asking that question of our nation today. This story of the suffragists, grassroots activists taking to the streets to confront injustice and inequality is very relevant right now. Now, if you read the standard history textbooks, you'll get only a brief and very fuzzy idea of how American women won, and that active verb is really important. Won the vote. Women were not given the vote. They were not granted the vote. As one suffrage historian has put it, we took it. And that is very true. But the way it's usually described is women asked for the vote at the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention in 1848, and then they were given the vote by enlightened American men in 1920. No, that's not how it happened. It required 3 generations of fearless activists working over 7 decades and in 900 campaigns to finally secure the vote for American women. And the culmination of that crusade, what we call the women's suffrage movement, came down to a fierce 6-week battle over ratification of the 19th Amendment, staged in Nashville, Tennessee, in the summer of 1920. And that's what my book, The Woman's Hour, is about. Now, in the summer of 1920, one last state was needed to ratify the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, giving all women in every state the right to vote in every election. 35 states had already ratified, and 36, or 3/4 of the states then in the Union, there were 48 at that time, were required for full ratification. And it turned out that Tennessee could be that 36th state. If the Tennessee legislature approved the amendment, it would become the law of the land just in time for the 1920 presidential election. But if the amendment failed in Tennessee, it could be delayed indefinitely and perhaps not enacted anytime in the near future. And when we think about the Equal Rights Amendment, which was introduced as the next constitutional amendment in 1923 and is still not ratified, we get a sense of what the suffragists feared if they lost in Tennessee. The enfranchisement of half of the citizens of the United States was at stake, and it all came down to Tennessee. Now, California women could already vote in 1920. How did that happen? Well, I'll tell you more about that in a minute. Now, by 1920, the suffragists had been fighting for the vote for more than 7 decades, since that first outrageous demand for the vote was made by Elizabeth Cady Stanton at the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention in 1848. Now, at that time, the concept of women's rights was really a contradictory phrase. It's useful to recall that in mid-19th century America, a woman had very few legal rights. A woman was not supposed to speak in public, doing what I'm doing for you right now. She could not attend most colleges or universities or professional schools. Most occupations were closed to her. If she was married, she could not own property or control her own money or inheritance. Everything she had belonged to her husband. Her children also belonged to their father. A mother had no custodial rights. A woman could not bring civil suit, nor testify in a court of law, nor serve on a jury. And of course, she could not vote. Nevertheless,
Stick with us just a moment. We seem to be having some technical difficulty.
hi, did we have a problem here?
We did, but you're live now.
Okay,
Thank you.
okay, going back. Okay, I'll start here. So a woman could not do many things which we take for granted today in the mid-19th century. Nevertheless, many of those attending the Seneca Falls meeting thought that asking for the vote was a terrible idea. It was too radical. It was too extreme. It would make them seem ridiculous. And this is a good reminder that radical ideas, which at first seem shocking and ridiculous, can, with time and effort, eventually enter mainstream thought. And in hindsight, these ideas always seem so obvious, no-brainers, but it takes foresight to see beyond the label of radical. So when Elizabeth Stanton asked for support for her resolution for the vote at Seneca Falls, it looked like it was going down to defeat. But a young man in the audience stood up. He had driven his buggy 50 miles from his home in Rochester to attend the meeting. And he stood up and he supported Elizabeth Stanton's call for the vote. And it was a young Frederick Douglass, just 30 years old, just 10 years out of slavery. And he stood up and said, "You must demand the vote. It will never be given to you, as it will never be given to me as a Black man, unless we demand and fight for it." And Frederick Douglass turned around that meeting in Seneca Falls. I really think that if it wasn't for Frederick Douglass convincing the other attendees to support the resolution, we'd never hear of Seneca Falls. And Frederick Douglass called himself very proudly a woman's rights man for the rest of his life, and he truly, truly was. He's very much the hero of my book. And he stood up for women's rights until his death in 1895, when just hours after attending a women's rights convention. Now, it was not a coincidence that Frederick Douglass was at Seneca Falls. He'd been invited because he'd been working with many of the women who organized this meeting for years, because women's rights and suffrage actually grew out of the abolition movement, the abolition of slavery movement. The foremothers of the suffrage movement, Elizabeth Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Susan Anthony, were abolition workers before they discovered the suffrage cause. And abolition and suffrage were sibling causes through the Civil War until there was a heartbreaking split after the war, when women were left out of the voting rights of the 14th and 15th Amendments. Black men, newly freed Black men were given the vote, but Black women and white women were not. And race would become a vexing issue employed by the suffragists when politically convenient, but really weaponized by the anti-suffragists, who used race to argue against women's enfranchisement. Now, in the years following Seneca Falls, tens of thousands of dedicated suffragists waged over 900 local, state, and national campaigns to win the ballot. They traveled hundreds of thousands of miles to do, as Susan Anthony described it, organize, educate, and agitate in tiny towns and big cities across the nation.
Yeah, very quick, Elaine. I think your PowerPoint stopped showing. If you might need to screen share.
Oh, okay. Let's see. I'm not seeing. Am I connected? Because I'm not seeing the webinar on my, am I here? Am I with you?
Yes, yes, you are. It might be minimized. We can hear and see you.
Okay, I do not see the controls for the webinar, so that would enable me to, yeah, where are the controls? Let's see. Okay, here we go. I've got it back. Thank you. So sorry. Okay, here we go. Share. How's that? Are we back?
Yes, it's back.
Okay. Well, just in time for my next slide. So women traveled hundreds of thousands of miles to do, as Susan Anthony described it, organize, educate, and agitate in tiny towns and big cities across the nation. And here you see they begin, well, actually they began a little before this. They begin in horse and buggy. And here we have another horse and buggy canvassing expedition. And by the end of the movement, they're traveling in automobiles. Now they had to change hearts and minds before they could even hope to change the law. And this is a crucial step, the education, the changing of hearts and minds and attitudes. And we find ourselves in that step right now as we try to educate our fellow citizens on the urgent need for racial justice and institutional reform, for confronting climate change, gun violence, and a host of other issues. And this was what the suffragists undertook. And really, when you think of it, the suffragists accomplished a stupendous feat of organization without any of the travel or communication tools we take for granted today. When the movement began, passenger trains were in their infancy. The telegraph was only recently invented. There was no typewriter, there was no telephone. And even in 1920, when my book takes place, radio was not in use yet. As one young woman in my publisher's office explained, when she read the manuscript, she came into my editor and she said, wow, these women were amazing. How did they do all this organizing without Facebook? But they did. They held rallies, they held meetings first, and then they held rallies, and they marched. They didn't wear pink pussy hats, but they did wear their marching clothes, white dresses with yellow sashes. And when you saw Vice President-elect Kamala Harris wear a white suit to make her first speech after winning the election, and when you saw J.Lo wear a white outfit when she performed at the inauguration ceremonies, they were honoring the suffragists by wearing white. Now, it's hard to imagine how difficult it was, how brave a woman had to be to stand up publicly for political equality. They endured contempt and ridicule in their communities, their churches, and in the press. We're going to see some very strong images of what the anti-suffrage movement distributed their attitudes about women who advocated for suffrage. Here's one, rather strong. They were pelted with rotten eggs and spoiled vegetables. They were attacked by mobs of angry men and boys, denounced as radicals, perverts, traitors, anarchists, bad wives and mothers, of course, and even Bolsheviks. Excuse me. They were derided as unattractive, unsexed she-men, and the men who supported them were belittled as Mabels and Nancys. And they supposedly were going to undermine the American family. And here we see an anti-suffrage poster. Which do you prefer? Your wife to be at home with a baby or a crazed zealot demonstrating in the streets. Again, they're depicted as being ugly and spinsters. Why would an attractive woman want the vote? She should have a man to vote for her. And you can kind of guess which one of these women was supposedly a suffragist. Again, undermining the American family and gender roles. Here's one: when women vote and mom is reading the sporting news and smoking a cigar while daddy has to take care of a screaming baby and also knit his own trousers out of her discarded skirts. Again, the idea that the American home is going to undergo a revolution if women can vote. And another anti-suffrage cartoon, again, mom is going to sail out on election day, leaving dad with the screaming babies again. The anti-suffragists were not subtle in what their fears were. What will men wear when women wear the skirts? It was going to emasculate American men if their women could have equal voice in government. And one of my favorite cartoons, Bed of Trouble, and this is kind of self-explanatory. Clearly, they were frightening to a large number of not only men, but also women at the time. Now, in their quest for equal citizenship, the women of the suffrage movement employed a wide variety of stratagems and methods, and many of these, marches, demonstrations, picketing, which we'll soon see, acts of civil disobedience, sophisticated lobbying and public relations operations, and legal test cases to the Supreme Court would be adopted by the civil rights campaigns of the 20th and 21st centuries. The suffragists were ingenious and fearless, they had to be, to test the prohibitions against women voting. Susan B. Anthony and Sojourner Truth and about 150 other women actually voted in the 1872 presidential election. Susan Anthony was soon arrested, and here we see a contemporary magazine depicting her as usurping Uncle Sam's hat. And it's called, drawing was called The Woman Who Dared. She was arrested, put on trial, and convicted of illegal voting in a federal election. Is it a crime for a US citizen to vote? She protested. And of course, that's still a valid question today, as so many of our citizens are denied the right to vote without hassle. Failure of this voting experiment led Elizabeth Stanton and Susan Anthony to draft a constitutional amendment that would supersede all the state laws prohibiting women from voting. This amendment was introduced into Congress in 1878, and it was stalled there for 40 years. The amendment was voted down in committee or on the floor of the House or Senate 28 times. Meanwhile, the suffragists worked to change laws in the states because states controlled the voting rights of their residents. And in California, there was always a very active suffrage movement. California women began agitating for the vote not long after the state entered the Union in 1850. By the 1870s, they were taking action. In 1871, Ellen Van Valkenburg of Santa Cruz sued the county clerk for refusing to include her name in the register of voters. Her case went up to the California Supreme Court, which ruled that no, she did not have the right as a citizen and a taxpaying citizen to vote. In 1879, California suffragists collected tens of thousands of signatures on a petition to amend the state constitution, and which afforded the vote only to white males. The petition was ignored. Soon after that, in 1884, the Los Angeles Women's Suffrage Association was formed, joining other suffrage groups already established in Northern California. And within the next decade, California would be surrounded by Western states, which allowed women to vote: Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho. So pressure was building. In 1893, the legislature in Sacramento actually passed a bill extending suffrage to women. But Governor Henry Markham vetoed it, claiming that female suffrage was unconstitutional. So suffragists came back to the legislature and convinced the lawmakers in Sacramento to put a women's suffrage referendum on the ballot in 1896. Now remember, only men could vote in these referenda to decide whether women deserved the right to vote. So the suffragists geared up for a massive campaign. Susan Anthony and other suffrage movement celebrities toured California to drum up support for the referendum. California could be a turning point for the movement. It would prove that women's suffrage was viable, not just in the sparsely populated Western states like Wyoming, but in the major population centers of California. Susan Anthony arrived in California in March and stayed until Election Day in November. She was on the stump every day during that time, sometimes giving several campaign speeches in a single day. She spoke in lecture halls and churches and schoolhouses and parlors, and even from the rear platform of her special touring train, decorated in yellow flowers, the suffrage color. Hundreds of other suffragists spoke in their communities too, including Naomi Bauman Anderson in San Francisco, an active advocate for suffrage, writing articles and giving speeches around the state, emphasizing the importance of the vote for Black women. But the referendum also had vigorous opposition, most notably from the liquor industry, which feared women voters might want to usher in prohibition laws. The Liquor Dealers League was very powerful. And on Election Day, the referendum was crushed. Only 40% approved of suffrage, 60% opposed it. It lost heavily in Northern California, especially in San Francisco, which was then the largest city in the state. And it garnered somewhat more support in Southern California. The suffragists were devastated, but they learned some valuable lessons, which they vowed to use next time. Now, the decade between the defeat in 1896 and 1906 was a period that's often called the Doldrums in the suffrage movement. But that's not to say nothing was happening. The State Suffrage Association grew stronger with the melding of the Northern and Southern California leagues. Suffragists were traveling by automobile to small towns, educating rural women about the importance of having a voice in the way they were governed. They were marching, as these women did in Oakland in 1908. And suffrage clubs were forming. The College Equal Suffrage League in San Francisco for young women students and teachers. And here is the Berkeley chapter. The Wage Earning Equal Suffrage League representing working women. The Political Equality League in Pasadena, attracting men to the cause. And the Votes for Women's Club in San Francisco for women in poor immigrant neighborhoods. Now, most of these suffrage clubs were, by custom, segregated. So African-American women had already formed their own suffrage clubs. The Fannie Jackson Coppin Club in Alameda County was a center for Black suffragists led by Lydia Ford Jackson and Hetty Tillman, who led that. Let me see, I think I missed that. Who led the women of the Coppin Club. By 1910, the suffragists were ready to try again. They were able to place another suffrage proposition on the ballot for the election of 1911. And this was to be the most intense campaign for the vote the nation had ever seen. California suffragists used the hard-won lessons from the 1896 defeat to refine their approach. They mobilized more than 10,000 campaign workers And they employed some novel campaign techniques besides the usual campaign materials of over 3 million pieces of suffrage literature, which they distributed, and over 90,000 buttons. And that was in Southern California alone. But they also had some more very novel techniques. They distributed playing cards and postcards and shopping bags. And here's again, pardon me, here's some of the women who were organized to get out the vote. And again, here's a advertisement for all the things that you could get, the kind of swag that was available for this campaign, including equality for the Women's Suffrage Party of California. It became quite a business. Now, the College Suffrage League held an art contest to design a poster, and this was the winner: Bertha Boyd's stunning Votes for Women painting, which became the symbol of the campaign. For an entire week in August, stores in San Francisco featured this colorful poster in their windows, often accompanied by festive decorations in suffrage yellow. And it is still today the most popular suffrage poster reproduced in modern editions. The California campaign used electric signs, 8-foot tall billboards, and lantern slides to deliver the suffrage message at night. Former President Theodore Roosevelt spoke to 10,000 people in the Greek Theater at Berkeley to support the suffrage effort. Suffragists spoke to male voters wherever they could find them, in factories, union halls, churches, and clubs. They spoke perched on soapboxes and on street corners, from the backs of buggies and trucks and automobiles. And the Blue Liner Auto took suffragists all around the state and on speaking tours, and became a very popular symbol of the campaign. And here you see the Blue Liner Auto. California suffragists brought their campaign not just to men, but to women as well, to convince them to support the cause. Maria de Lopez, a Los Angeles college educator, was the Spanish translator for the California movement, and she helped produce campaign materials in Spanish like this one, and is credited with making the first suffrage speech in Spanish. Selena Solomons was a San Franciscan who understood that not all suffragists were middle or upper class or wealthy women and could afford to just work for the cause for free. She believed that the referendum defeat of 1896 was due in part to the fact that the movement was elitist and didn't speak to shop girls or factory workers or immigrant women. So she founded the Votes for Women Club in San Francisco to bring these women into the fold. The club hosted lectures and forums and cultural performances advocating votes for women. It offered nourishing meals for a nickel and a library well stocked with suffrage literature. Solomon's hope was to come to eat, stays to read and talk. Solomons organized the young women who dropped by for lunch to accompany her on canvassing missions into the South of Market area, where many working class women lived. And the canvassers also tried to convince the women's husbands, who often took a lot of convincing. As the referendum campaign grew to a close, 10,000 people attended what was called a monster rally in San Francisco, complete with a concert and fireworks. Sounds very modern, doesn't it? But trouble was brewing. The suffragists were warned that the anti-suffragists, determined to stop the referendum from winning, intended to play some mischief at the polls in San Francisco. So on election day, Selena Solomon's Vote for Women's Club mustered a battalion of poll watchers, over 1,000.
Okay, stick with us just a moment. Hopefully she'll be right back in.
we go down again?
Yes, but you're back live, but
Hello?
without your PowerPoint again.
Okay, let's go to the PowerPoint.
Okay, I think it's a
Alrighty.
buffering issue, but you come right back when you drop out.
Okay, we're back here. Sorry. Okay. On election night, so we're all set. We're back up.
Yes, you're great.
Great. On election night, the results look grim for the suffragists. Once again, San Francisco voted down the measure, and it was barely passing in Los Angeles, and it only squeaked by in San Diego. Many newspapers announced the defeat of the referendum in their morning editions. The vote tally took a full 3 days. Does that sound familiar? And when the final results were in, the suffrage referendum had passed very narrowly by the equivalent of 1 vote in each precinct in the state, proving every vote counts. California was able to put the 6th star on the suffrage flag. It was the 6th state to allow women to vote. 4 million California women were now eligible to vote. The number of American women with full suffrage rights had doubled overnight. And here are California women registering to vote. But there were still 42 states where women could not vote and probably would never be allowed to. And the only hope was a federal amendment. But that federal amendment was still stuck in Congress. The slow pace of progress in Congress and in the states stirred frustration and anger amongst the suffragists. A new generation of suffragists, the third, grew impatient, no longer willing to wait or to plead politely or to ask for the vote. They were willing to be aggressive, rude, disruptive if necessary, even willing to break the law. The movement split, as reform movements often do, over strategy and tactics. A young New Jersey woman named Alice Paul left the mainstream movement to try a different approach. Her National Women's Party picketed the White House, protested on the steps of the Capitol, and burned President Woodrow Wilson in effigy. Hundreds of Women's Party suffragists were arrested and served time in prison for their civil disobedience. The suffrage prisoners were held in decrepit, vermin-infested cells. They were physically assaulted, clubbed, tied to the wall, not allowed to read or write or even to speak to one another. They communicated by singing. And when they refused to eat, they were force-fed, tubes rammed down their noses. Finally, in 1919, after World War I was over, the federal amendment was passed by both houses of Congress and sent to the states for ratification. So a year later, in the summer of 1920, the amendment was on the cusp of victory, or possibly defeat, as it arrived in Tennessee, because Tennessee was a dangerous place to stage this definitive battle for women's suffrage. Nearly all the other Southern states had already rejected the amendment, and all using the same racist rationale. They did not want Black women to vote. The suffragists faced an uphill battle in Tennessee, but they had no choice. It was their last best chance. So all the forces for and against women's suffrage gathered in Nashville, and there were powerful forces working against ratification, political, corporate, and ideological foes, each with their own reasons for opposing the amendment. Politicians who feared an unpredictable new voting bloc, clergymen who believed that women voting went against the will of God, as they called it, and corporations that believed women would be bad for business. But the most passionate foes of the 19th Amendment turned out to be women. That women might oppose the enfranchisement of their own sex was really shocking to me. Many of these antis, as they were called, or antis, were social and religious conservatives who feared that suffrage would bring about a profound and unhealthy shift in gender roles. It would endanger the American home and bring about what they called the moral collapse of the nation. It would alter private life, not just political life. And this is an important reminder that the debate over women's suffrage was never just a political argument. It was also a social and cultural, and for some, a moral debate about women's role in society. It was a precursor to what we now call the culture wars, and that's what made it so divisive. So all sides confront one another in Nashville, and it gets wild. There's bribes and booze and propaganda and blackmail, conspiracies and kidnappings and fistfights, and the newspapers call it suffrage Armageddon. The outcome remains in doubt until the very last moment. And I won't spoil it for you, but it does come down to a single vote of conscience from the youngest member of the legislature, who receives a letter from his mother. Now, all this took place almost, actually, just about a century ago. But there are surprising and even unnerving modern themes in this story. This history helps explain where we've been and where we are today. It deals with topics which dominate our headlines right now: voting rights and voter suppression, women's rights, inequality, dark money in politics, the role of religion in public policy, and the politics of protest, and racism, because the history of suffrage in America is inevitably a story about race. In Nashville, there were cries of white supremacy and states' rights. The Ku Klux Klan is invoked as a dog whistle, and the Confederate flag is waved in defiance. And we have heard echoes of all of that very recently. It required courage, creativity, and persistence to change the mind of the nation and to change the Constitution to allow women to vote. There were many defeats. There were more defeats than victories. There was betrayal and disappointment. They had to keep going. The suffragists had to try Plan B and then Plan C. Making change is never quick, and it is never easy. But I hope the story of the suffragists will teach a new generation of activists that protest is patriotic and necessary, but it must be followed up by well-designed and sustained political strategies. The suffragists did not just march and demonstrate and picket. They also debated and lobbied and drafted legislation and campaigned. They had well-defined goals, and they mastered the political tools to accomplish those goals. They even had to campaign during a time of a pandemic. In 1918 and 19, the influenza pandemic raged through America, and they couldn't hold rallies or even meet in person. So they organized using the mail and the post office, and even tacking up posters on trees. And they did not rest after the 19th Amendment entered the Constitution. Carrie Chapman Catt founded the League of Women Voters, which is still working to improve voter education and voter access today. And Alice Paul drafted the Equal Rights Amendment, which was introduced into Congress in 1923. It is still not fully ratified. This history also reveals that reform movements are imperfect. The story of women's suffrage is both an inspiring and a cautionary tale. It's complicated, it's messy. There were moral compromises made to achieve success that should and do make us wince. White suffragists were often too willing to leave their Black sisters behind. We must learn from the mistakes of the movement as well as from its accomplishments. Another lesson we learn is that the struggle to expand our democracy is ongoing. It was not accomplished in 1920, and it is not complete today. While the 19th Amendment did give the vote to all women citizens, Black women and men in the southern states would not be able to enjoy their right to vote for another 4 decades. Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, literacy tests, intimidation, and violence kept them from the polls until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 provided a legal remedy. Native American women and Asian American women were not considered citizens in 1920, and so they were not covered by the 19th Amendment, and they also had to wait decades longer to vote. In recent years, essential enforcement provisions of the Voting Rights Act have been gutted, and we see an alarming number of states enacting laws restricting access to the polls for targeted voters. Since the November election, in which a record number of voters participated, more than 250 bills to restrict voting have been introduced in 33 state legislatures, again aimed at minority voters, again making it harder to vote. Today, our responsibility is to protect the vote for all citizens. We cannot and should not accept cynical attempts to rob citizens of their right to vote. Voting rights is not a partisan issue. It is the stress test of the health of our democracy, and we are too often failing that test. Also, it is our duty to use that hard-won vote, not only in presidential elections every 4 years, but in your state and local elections as well. Elected officials at the state and local level make policy that affects your life and determines your future. And in California's initiative system, important policy is often decided by popular vote. Use the power that you possess, the power won for you by the suffragists of the early 20th century, won for you by the bravery of John Lewis and Fannie Lou Hamer, and the fearless civil rights activists of the mid-20th century, and won for you by courageous and committed voting activists today, working to defend our electoral system. The vote is a prayer, as the suffragists called it. The vote is power. Your future and the future of our democracy depends upon it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Elaine. That was wonderful. I really enjoyed it. I have a few questions coming in from the audience that I'd like to ask, and I want to start with one I think frames the whole topic. And I'm going to add to the question, which is, it seems very much that in addition to being a history of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, in some ways this is a how-to manual to achieve increased democracy, equality, and representation. So can you talk a little bit about that in conjunction with what led you to write about this important topic?
Well, what led me to write about it was that I realized I did not know how I, as an American woman, had gained the right to vote. I had not learned it in school. I had not really read about it more than a paragraph. And I realized this was such an important history. And as your question indicates, such a blueprint for how citizens can make change. Because the suffragists were not empowered in any way. Women had very, very little power at that time. And yet they organized at the local level and grew larger and larger until it was a decisive confrontation between the ideal of what America says it is or wants to be and the reality. And the reality was half of the nation could not have any voice in their government. And so I think it is very much a blueprint for how to organize. The women had to raise their own funds. They had to convince others to join them. And then they had to convince men at every level, not only in their own families, but in their town, and then going into their legislatures. There was just a constant educational and lobbying campaign going on. And these women had to learn to become orators, to be public speakers, to be campaign managers, to run very sophisticated political campaigns. They had to master, as I say, these political tools. And that's something I think that activists understand today, but I think it's that step between protest and demonstration and political agency that is sometimes needs more more support and more emphasis. And so I really do hope that the suffragists made lots of mistakes. And again, the idea of not realizing, well, not acting upon the realization that Black women in the South would not be allowed to vote is a real failing. And the segregation of the movement in most aspects is, again, a failing of the time, but a failing of our nation too. And so I think we really need to look at both the accomplishments and the failings of this movement, but we can learn a great deal from it.
Thank you. You mentioned not knowing how women won the suffrage, and you touch on the anti-suffrage in your presentation and significantly in your book. And I think for a lot of modern women, it's shocking to realize that many women, including Eleanor Roosevelt and Edith Wilson, women in the North and South opposed having the right to vote. You talk a little bit about this in relation to the concept of true womanhood, but can you unpack it a little bit for the audience, how a woman could oppose her own rights as a citizen?
Yeah, it's pretty shocking when because I had no idea that there were organized women working to thwart the idea of other women voting. And I realized that it was very important to try to understand, not to agree, but to understand the anti-suffragists, that it was important for my story, and it's important historically. And it's even very valuable today, because a lot of the women who opposed the suffrage were political and cultural and sometimes religious conservative women. And they truly believed that for those who were religiously opposed to it, that this went against biblical teaching, that their interpretation was that God had made Eve to be subservient to Adam, and to question this was against God's plan. And that's how they argue against the idea of suffrage. And many clergy agree with them on that. Then there are those who were morally offended by the idea of women voting. For them, women had possessed a spiritual purity that made them special and elevated and above the fray of dirty politics. And if women, put their skirts into the dirty muck of politics, they would be forever tarred by this, and they would no longer have this special moral superiority, basically, that they professed. And it's really interesting to look at that. And some of them, again, said, I don't want the vote. I would rather that I not be sullied by the dirt of politics, the corruption of politics as they saw it. And then there are those who were also kind of politically attuned. And they said, look, women have accomplished a lot in terms of policy during the progressive era without the vote. They had what they called soft power. Because they were not involved in the political process, they could go to men and say, look, we need these laws for, safety of milk or the safety of water or other public health issues. And we don't have a political stake in this. We're doing this for the good of the community. And that, in their mind, gave them even more power than being part of the political process. You can debate that. And of course, some of these women were quite, some of these were wealthy women. And for them, you know, they didn't need the vote. Their father was mayor or their brother was a congressman. They had the ear of men in power. And so they didn't feel they needed the vote, whereas the factory working woman or the wife and mother really felt that she needed the vote to protect herself and her family. So you have all these different layers, and some of the anti-suffragists fell into several of those camps, and some only one or two. But I found it fascinating to look at their arguments and realize that we are still hearing those arguments, modern versions of those arguments, that you know, gender, that the idea of equality is disruptive to established gender roles. Well, we heard that recently with gender equality, with marriage equality. We hear many of those same arguments, you know, in a modern framework from conservative women, and it's very important that we understand it and realize that it comes from an historical base.
Yes, thank you for that answer. And finishing there on the profound and unhealthy shift in gender roles made me think, as you were showing the different slides, that you would have some individuals today who said, look, see, they were right. Men have been emasculated, women have abandoned their role as the sacred keepers of the Republic. And so definitely some of those ideas continue. The audience seemed to really appreciate your focus on California, since we are in California. You did an amazing job showing the national influence of people like Anthony, but then also the role of African Americans and Latinas. Was the suffrage movement in California more integrated than other states, or more integrated in the West in general compared to the other states in the US?
Well, I'm not an expert in the demographics there. I would say in California, that it probably wasn't very much more integrated, because even in the West, things were still segregated. So they were welcomed into the movement, but not into perhaps the white women's suffrage clubs. So they start their own, you know, and also they may not be called suffrage clubs. They might, again, Black women worked through their churches. They worked through the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. They worked through the NAACP, which begins in 1909. So they are working through other channels for suffrage. It may not have been called a suffrage club. In the other states, there were actually very few Black residents. So I don't think that entered into it quite as much as it might in a more cosmopolitan place like California. But again, we have the Asian population is not included in this because they're not considered citizens. That will change in the 1920s, but it's really not until the 1940s. Pardon me, it'll change in the 1920s a bit, but it's not until the 1940s that women, Asian American women, are allowed to vote, or men. And in terms of Native women and men, again, that is what changes in 1924 with their citizenship. But at the state level, there's still states that didn't allow Native Americans to vote until, in some cases, the 1950s. So it's a very, very, very slow rollout. So I would not say that integration was further ahead. I think it was, there may have been some progressive elements, but for the most part, people worked in their own sphere.
Great, thank you. Now, you spoke of the effectiveness of the women's suffrage movement and working in various levels, from petitions to lobbying, etc. Was there any one factor that was more effective in women getting the 19th Amendment ratified?
In terms of strategies, methods?
Just what got traction with the men who had to vote? Because you spoke about how women fought for and won the vote. This wasn't a gift of men, but in some ways, men did play a role because they had to pass these bills, ratify these amendments, in some ways decreasing their own power to increase by giving women power. So what convinced most men, if you can answer that question?
That's a great question. And it's true that it's, you see different approaches working in different situations and different states at different times. So for some men, they realize this is a question of justice and of democracy, and they're early adopters of the idea of women's suffrage, including Congressman Aaron Sargent of California, who is, his wife Ellen Sargent is a very prominent suffrage leader in the state. And they also befriend Susan B. Anthony when they're all stranded on a train journey through the Rockies in a snowstorm. And they become friends. And so it is Congressman Sargent who actually introduces the federal amendment into Congress in 1878. So you have men who are persuaded, sometimes by their wives, of the justice of this, that women are citizens, they're taxpayers, they ought to be able to vote. Others come around to it very slowly, and often there is a political advantage for them or a political disadvantage for them that determines their position. And you see this change, what they react to change over time. So by the time World War I is over and the amendment has been passed by the House, by the House of Representatives in Congress, but not by the Senate, you see that the arguments that women are too emotional and flighty and not physically or intellectually strong enough to vote, which is one of the old canards that was used all through to counter the idea of women being able to vote. After what women do in World War I, after the kind of roles they take on, which were unprecedented during the war, those arguments sound very hollow. And so congressmen may still make them, but nobody's listening to them quite as much. And then you see partisan advantage too. The Republican Party was much better about enacting suffrage at the state level and in Congress than the Democrats were. And so you see it by 1920, when there's a presidential election, you see them really vying for the ability to take credit for this. And that becomes an interesting subtext in the book. And then someone like Woodrow Wilson, who was against suffrage his entire career, just a vociferous opponent of women voting. And his second wife is very much against it too. But you see him come around. And the reason for that is that he needs women to vote and to support his idea of League of Nations coming out of World War I. This idea of a world court and a way to prevent a terrible war again. And he sees women as the key to his legacy. So you see very interesting arguments being used. And the suffragists were brilliant in how they would frame the argument for each individual legislator. They kept records. There were amazing files on every member of Congress and then every state legislature that had their supporters, the issues, who they owed money to, the skeletons in their closets. The women knew how to approach every legislator. And when it came to the Southern legislators, both in Congress and in the State House, here's where the white suffragists were willing to make arguments like, don't worry about women's suffrage and Black women voting. There are more white women in the South than Black. It won't upset white supremacy. They use that argument because they know it'll work. And that's the only way they will get the Southern legislative support they need, both to pass the amendment in Congress and then to get it ratified. So it's politically expedient, it's morally suspect.
Okay, sorry, my computer froze there. So I want to end with one final question, and that is, you characterize Frederick Douglass as the hero of the book because at Seneca Falls, he really clinched the passage of especially the 9th resolution by speaking in favor of the women's right to vote, when many men who did support women's rights in general didn't support that. Who would you say is the female hero of the book, or suffrage in general?
Well, there's so many. That's kind of hard, like asking a mom her favorite child. Susan Anthony is quite amazing, quite an amazing woman, an organizer and thinker. Elizabeth Stanton is a thinker. Susan Anthony is the activist of the pair. And so I admire her, especially Susan Anthony, just immensely. Carrie Chapman Catt, who takes the movement into the 20th century, the master strategist who really makes all the tactical decisions to get the amendment through. And then you have Alice Paul, who's a zealot and who is single-minded about getting the vote and women's rights and is willing to go to prison and be tortured for it. So you have different types of heroines. And because this movement encompasses 3 generations, there's sort of, I would say that, you have Susan Anthony in the first generation and Carrie Catt in the second and Alice Paul in the third. But there are so many millions of women at the state and local level who were amazing too. And that's one of the great things about the centennial is that there's been a lot more research at the local and state level to bring the names of these suffragists to the fore, who were incredible activists and politicians.
You do an amazing job capturing the strengths and the human nature of all of these characters. So I really encourage everybody to read Elaine Weiss's book, The Woman's Hour. She will be back at 2:00 and we'll address new questions from the audience. And we look forward to seeing you then. And we thank you so much for your time and your excellent contribution to women's history.
My pleasure.
Okay, thank you, everyone. We'll see you at 2:00.